Today is the Impact Summit, so it's a good time to discuss how COVID-19 has impacted the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. The 2030 Agenda provides a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet now and into the future. At its heart are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are an urgent call for action by all countries, developed and developing, in a global partnership to end poverty, improve health and education, reduce inequality and spur economic growth, all while tackling climate change and environmental preservation. So how will countries, corporates and individual stakeholders apply principles of these 17 Sustainable Development Goals in their post-pandemic recovery and growth plans? To bring us through this discovery is Satya Tripathi, United Nations Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations Environment. This will be moderated by Sonja Gibbs, Managing Director and Head of Sustainable Finance at the Institute of International Finance. So let's now go on over to Sonja and Satya.
Thank you very much. And good morning, everybody, and welcome to our session today, which we've called The Path to 2030. Emerging Stronger Post-Pandemic, and that's certainly something we all want to do. I do have the honor today of moderating a conversation with UN Assistant Secretary General Satya Tripathi. Mr. Tripathi's had a very distinguished career with the United Nations and is additionally on the Board of Trustees of the Green Indian States Trust. He's also served as CEO of the Tropical Landscapes Finance Facility and as chair of the Sustainable India Finance Facility, and clearly bringing a wealth of knowledge and experience to our topic here today on post-pandemic resilience. This is such an important set of issues, bringing together key topics like attracting private capital in support of sustainable development goals, scaling up finance from the multilateral development banks, innovation in infrastructure finance, and the appropriate policy and regulatory framework to make all of this happen. So, Satya, it's wonderful to have you with us here today for this conversation. Why don't we go ahead and get started? First of all, are you concerned about the very ambitious timeline for the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals? And has the COVID-19 pandemic thrown us off track?
Thank you, Sonja. It's great to be here today. Well, the Sustainable Development Goals, when they were put together by the member states ahead of 2015, it had a timeline. I mean, like with all programs, you need to have a timeline so that you can measure progress and you can report success. And so this also had a 15-year timeline, and we are at the 5-year mark now. And even before COVID-19 struck, there were serious concerns about several of the goals underperforming in terms of the ambition and the achievement. But we still have 10 years to go, and that's quite a bit of time to do what is right. COVID-19 has, apart from all the devastation it has wreaked around the planet, it has also exacerbated the inequalities. The vulnerable and the marginalized are the most impacted, and that's what we need to keep in mind as we recalibrate in the run to the end of the SDG goals by 2030. The other thing that I would like to highlight is that while COVID-19 is a matter of serious concern for literally everyone on the planet, it is also a fact that this is something much smaller compared to the climate challenge we are facing. And it will be useful to remind ourselves that while the scientists are telling us that it is important for us to stay at 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming by the turn of the century, the World Meteorological Organization came up with a report a few weeks earlier that is actually telling us that we have 70% chance of hitting the 1.5 degree mark in the next 5 years. That's how dire the situation is. and COVID only makes it worse.
No, it is certainly a source of concern around the world. Policymakers, private sector, I think everybody is weighing the impact of both of these factors, the COVID-19 pandemic coupled with the broader climate crisis and environmental concerns, natural capital, biodiversity, the whole spectrum. But, one really big issue, you mentioned inequality. And one of the biggest sources of inequality has been this massive accumulation of global debt. And that's also constraining public sector balance sheets. And the public sector is traditionally, the largest provider of development finance. So given this and the massive financing gaps for the Sustainable Development Goals, how do you see the future of development finance evolving?
Well, we need to rethink development finance and think a little out of the box. And why do I say that? Because if you look at the global economy, the GDP is pretty much 70% private sector and 30% public sector. For too long, we have taken 30% of the pie and tried to do everything with it. We need to really think out of the box and see how the private sector can contribute gainfully in this whole conversation, not just COVID, not just climate change. And we have great examples here. I mean, you mentioned COVID earlier. If you look at the Pfizer example, Pfizer didn't take any money from any government. It still produced its own vaccine. And it's the first off the block vaccinating people. So there are models where you can actually use the private sector in the most difficult of times to do what is right and what is in public interest. And for that, we need to create these virtuous partnerships. There are not too many, but you can indeed do that. And there are quite a few examples. I could cite the example of Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance. There are multiple global funds, which are partnerships between government, private sector, a multitude of stakeholders. So we really need to relook development finance. Sometimes small amounts of development finance can go a long way. People often say pilots don't fail. And I often think that pilots don't fail, but they don't scale either, because you throw tons of grant money into making a pilot a success, but a proof of concept is not a proof of application. A proof of application is not proof of scale, and a proof of scale is not a proof of system scale transition, which we need at this time to deal with the twin challenges of climate change and losing all the development impacts we have had over the decades, because COVID is creating even bigger problems, exacerbating the inequalities and increasing the number of people who are now slipping further into poverty. So we really need to think differently. We need to take a very strategic look at development finance and see where we can leverage it.
Well, I really think you've just put your finger on the crux of the matter, the need to really scale this kind of financing from the billions to the trillions. It's a very, very big goal. So, if you think about the UN Addis Ababa Action Agenda, building on that, the Paris Agreement, one of the things that came out of those was that the world's major multilateral development banks, like the World Bank, have all committed to significantly increase their allocations to climate finance. And this is also reflected in the private sector, where you see commitments scaling up by the day to decarbonize their investments and all of their global lending and investment activity around the world, assessing their carbon footprint. So one of the key areas for collaboration between the public and private sector is around infrastructure. So what are some of the ways that we can de-risk and lower the cost of bringing in private finance for infrastructure and other development finance goals?
Indeed, and we really need to look at the whole the economic model in the current state that we find ourselves in, and see how multilateral development banks can help. Climate finance in the past has predominantly gone into really safe investments. If you look at the Climate Investment Fund, which is disbursed close to $10 billion, it has been primarily into renewables. And even in renewables, it has been solar energy mostly because it's quantifiable, you can amortize the costs over a certain period of time, and it's predictable. But if you take the entire global steel industry, the automotive industry, the IT and the IT enabled services industry, all of them together produce about 35 million jobs globally. But if you take agriculture, and especially smallholder agriculture, it employs 1 billion people. And then if you take all those that are dependent on those smallholder farms and the farmers, you can easily extrapolate that to 4 billion people that live off agriculture directly. And of course, we all benefit from agriculture. So we really need to look at what is climate finance and what is infrastructure. Is infrastructure just the brown infrastructure? Because history tells us that every bit of built infrastructure has come at the cost of ecological infrastructure. And that's why we have the climate challenge. So we really need to redefine what we call infrastructure. Ecological infrastructure is even more important than conventional architecture or conventional infrastructure as we understand it, because without the stocks and flows in nature and the natural resources that it produces, we will have no infrastructure as we know it. So we have to find a fine balance between both, but not one or the other.
Well, I think that's a growing trend, isn't it? For 2021, you see a great deal more attention being paid in policy circles to questions around natural capital, biodiversity, and finding funding for these goals and bringing them into the broader spectrum of the types of things we're trying to finance. So on that note, on financing, a lot of the work you've done, it's just been so fascinating, has dealt with innovative financing structures and facilities to help mobilize private finance. So tell us about some of these and how they work in the real world, you know?
Well, I think it's simple and it's complex. It is simple because it is just about bringing together a whole set of actors who individually will not be able to deal with an impossible problem, perhaps, but together the problem just disappears. Let me start with the Tropical Landscapes Finance Facility in Indonesia. There, the first project was a partnership with Michelin. It's a $350 million project. And interestingly enough, Michelin had the concession of the forest estate. It was a conservation concession for almost 7 years before the TLFF was established at the end of 2016, and they approached us in 2017. And by building a partnership around the idea without having fixed structures that you're paying for, exponential costs, you could just bring together and you'd be happy to note that we were able to catalyze that $350 million project with roughly about $1 million of public finance. Now, mind you, the TLFF is a public facility. It is owned by nobody. It is supported by UNEP, the World Agroforestry Center, with partnerships with BNP Paribas and ADM Capital. But it's a coming together of very distinct entities with interests that converge. So UNEP and World Agroforestry Center's interests were about ecosystems, about people and planet. ADM Capital was very keen to do something that is very different from the debt management they did before. So, and then BNP Paribas really wanted to segue from the brown economy to the green economy. So there was a convergence of interests, but most importantly, the development finance that was used is less than $1 million to catalyze a $350 million project, which a company like Michelin, which has its own substantive credentials and credit ratings, couldn't go to the market and raise the money because they wanted non-recourse credit and they wanted resources for a longer period of time. So the first bond that was issued was $95 million out of Singapore, and and the money was raised at costs exponentially lower than what was available in the market for non-recourse project finance for degraded land in Indonesia. And then we took the same idea to India with the Sustainable India Finance Facility. There, the first project is $2.6 billion, and it is converting 6 million farmers to zero chemical farming. We're supporting the government of Andhra Pradesh state, a state of 50 million people, and a very progressive state in India that really wants to become the first system scale natural farming state in the country. And what they're doing is at planetary scale, because they're converting 6 million farmers with 8 million hectares of land. And as of today, they have converted almost 1 million farmers, and all with no subsidies, and just empowering the farmers, building their capacity, and hats off to the women farmers in this particular state that are actually rewriting environmental and planetary history as I speak, because we gather around these, like the Singapore FinTech Festival and many others around the world, and we talk about risk mitigation, we talk about, oh, there is so much risk, how do we change? And here are women farmers that literally live from one crop cycle to another crop cycle, and their entire families and their children, health, nutrition, schooling, everything depends on it. And they are willing to give up chemical farming that they have practiced for 5 decades to do something extremely different, which is bioinoculation, regenerative agriculture, and they are showing the way to the world. So these ideas are there. These champions are there. We need to find these champions. We need to build the partnerships. We need to bring the different actors together and build a movement which is extremely important at this point of time. So in the next 10 years, we need to produce $1 trillion of impact investments. And that's the path that we are on. And I'm so happy to share that with you.
Well, there's some really striking elements to what you've been saying. I think one is clearly the amount of leverage that you're getting from a really quite small amount of public finance to gear up private finance. That's one thing. The other is how these innovations are enabling a new technology to assist in the fight against climate change, in the battle to limit global warming. And so to see that sort of deployed into action is phenomenal. So hats off to that, and lots more of it. But I mean, that's one issue, isn't it? I mean, these, as you say, they're not pilots. You know, they're actively gearing up, scaling up. But to truly leverage, you know, the scale of global bond markets in the trillions and global debt markets, you know, really needs deep and liquid markets for this to happen. You need instruments, green bonds and social bonds and SDG linked bonds and so on, benchmarks and yield curves, derivatives, good market infrastructure. How would you assess how these markets are faring to date? And where do we need to go from here?
I think they're faring very poorly on multiple indicators that you mentioned, except for green bonds, where they've done extremely well. But that again is a very narrow alley. Green bonds have primarily funded renewable infrastructure, mostly solar and wind, occasionally hydro and thermal. But very little investment has gone into sustainable agriculture, which can actually transform the planet. And why do I say that? Because it's about public health, the global burden of disease, that the endocrine disruptors that we consume through pesticide residues and over-fertilizing our agricultural landscape. And so there has been too little investment. And that's why I was extremely happy earlier this year when KfW, the German Development Bank, put in $300 million, the first set of investments into that $2.6 billion project in India that I mentioned. It was their first sustainable agriculture investment at this scale, at extremely low coupon, even much less than development finance from multilateral development banks. And I told them at that time, I said, bravo to you, and do much more of this, because this is what is going to save the planet. Because yes, you are only investing from a narrow lens into sustainable agriculture. But imagine what it does, because it reduces the input costs by 80% roughly, increases the yield between 28 to 200%. With every crop cycle, you're switching more and more from soil chemistry to soil biology. As the soil becomes healthier and healthier and healthier, you would not need to invest much more, and the agriculture will become perennial. And if anybody is looking for evidence, walk into a rainforest. Nobody has put a pinch of fertilizer, I mean synthetic chemical fertilizer, in a rainforest. And they are the most healthiest and most living, breathing ecosystems on the planet. Because nature takes care of it. Nature is harmonic, nature is circular, and if humans don't happen to nature, nature can take care of itself. So let us be kind, and let us really look the evidence in the eye and swallow our arrogance a little bit and say that yes, nature has the answers. Let us listen to nature and let us do what is right. And the possibilities will just open up immensely.
Well, maybe you need something of a slogan. Nature can take care of itself if markets look after nature. Something like that. Markets
Absolutely.
can fund nature. But along those lines, and I wanted to follow up on something you'd said. You mentioned KfW and its relatively modest investment and the huge success that that's had. Would you say that the development finance institutes and the providers of finance on the public sector side have generally been pleased with the results of their investments, and are they motivated to do more of them?
They are, and they need to, because whatever we see in terms of the conventional or the traditional financial architecture is literally going to wither away if we cannot deal with the challenge of runaway climate change. And that's unfolding in front of our eyes every day. Whether you look at the forest fires that ravaged 5 million acres of land in the United States just recently, or look back to 2015 in Indonesia, where the forest and peat fires were emitting toxic fumes and emissions bigger than the industrialized nations like Germany and the UK, and some days they were even surpassing the total emissions in a country like the United States. Or the bushfires in Australia, or the hurricanes that you see in the Caribbean now. So these are telltale signs of what is happening. These are not random fluctuations in the weather map of the world. These are trends that we really need to look at. And sometimes it really beats me, because the financial sector, each one of us that has spent time in that particular sector knows that the entire architecture revolves around risk, estimating risk, managing risk, and mitigating risk. How can we not see the challenge of climate change for what truly it is? And then that's what I think is absolutely crucial. The second point I would like to make is that the power of providing counter guarantees. Let me start with the TLFF. The first tranche of 95 million that we did was kindly supported by the Development Credit Authority of the USAID. And we took that guarantee to Moody's, and then Moody's gave us a AAA guarantee, a AAA credit rating for the bond. And that made it possible for us to go to the capital markets and raise the money at extremely reasonable rates for 15 years. The same with KfW. KfW is a direct loan to the provincial government of Andhra Pradesh, but it is KfW's credibility that allows it to borrow at extremely low coupon and then pass it on with a few add-ons, but still extremely low coupon from the perspective of the borrower. And then thankfully now, US has now merged OPIC and USAID DCA, and they have created this US Development Finance Corporation. And I sincerely hope that they really look at this particular piece and possibly create a $100 billion guarantee fund, bring together other banks, other multilaterals, other development finance institutions, because that really changes the whole dynamic. To go back to the TLFF example, the guarantee from USAID DCA wasn't free. They receive a fee for it, but so they stand to gain because they're not giving the money, but just a guarantee and assuming a bit of the risk. But at the same time, that support is fundamental to turning the tide on the climate challenge. So we should not look at grants, because I think as useful as that is, that has better uses in terms of leveraging private finance for public good. So public finance can be that little lubricant that makes things work. But at the same time, if we can create that kind of possibility on a global scale, and then go and empower the champions across the planet, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, in different parts of Europe that need the most, like we are working in Serbia, that has hundreds of thousands of hectares of degraded land that could easily be biomass forests, and then substitute the extremely polluting coal they have to use. But sermonizing Serbia that you need to get rid of your coal, or for that matter, Southeast Europe, is easier said than done. What we need to do is stand with countries that have these opportunities and get them the kind of resources they need to make change happen.
Well, that is actually a very hopeful note for us to conclude on. I wish we'd had more time. This has been a tremendously thought-provoking conversation. And I want to thank you, Satya, for taking part in it today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonja. Pleasure.
Thank you.
And thanks for that, Sonja and Satya. Now, definitely good points made on suggestions on how to meet those sustainability goals. Certainly, the points made in this discussion gels very well with a report released recently by the United Nations. And that report talked about how an additional 207 million people could be pushed into extreme poverty by 2030 because of the long-term impact of the coronavirus pandemic. But the report also does say that if a focused set of investments were to be made over the next 10 years, it could mean that these 2030 goals would be met ahead of schedule. So certainly along the same lines as what Satya was talking about, focused investments on sustainable agriculture. Great discussion there.